good morning. Thank you very much for joining us in this side event of the World Science Forum, focusing on the use of the hazard information profile to help standardizing hazard information for policymakers. This is focusing on one project that is currently conducted by the International Science Council and the UN Agency for Disaster Risk Reduction on the review of the hazard information profile. I would like first to introduce the members of our panels. We have first Professor Virginia Murray, who is the chair of the steering group in charge of the review of the hazard information profile. She works currently for the UK Health Security Agency, but she's also a fellow of the International Science Council. She has worked for several years for the Integrated Research on Disaster Risk and has a lot of experience on doing this type of work. And she was the chair of the original group to already provide the hazard information profile and classification. Next, we have Professor Teresa Oliveira from the International Statistics Institute, where she chairs the Committee on Risk Assessment. And she also is a professor at the Open University of Lisbon in mathematics and statistics. Next, we have Professor Urbano Fra Paleo, who is a representative from the European Science and Technology Advisory Group to the UN Agency for Disaster Risk Reduction, and is also a professor of human geography at the University of Extremadura. And myself, I'm Hélène Jacot-Descombes. I am working at the International Science Council, where I'm the project manager for the review of the hazard information profile. And before that, I was teaching climate change adaptation and disaster risk management in the University of the South Pacific in Fiji. We will have in our presentation a video from another of our members, which is Dr. Carolina Velasquez, who works for the Florida State University and who will show you an example of how the hazard information profile can be used in the local institution and local governments. I would like to give the floor to Professor Murray for the introduction on what are the HIPs and how they were developed originally. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hélène. It's a delight to be at the World Science Forum again. I have been to many of them, and it's a great pleasure to work with so many scientists and to bring the scientific networks together. So this funny word called HIPs. Well, it's not actually the hip that you have on you. This stands for the Hazard Information Profile. And I just wanted to share with you, at Hélène's suggestion, how they were developed and why they exist. So, can I just move the slide? Please. Oh, sorry, it doesn't, not thinking down below. Okay, right, let me go from there. When we were reviewing how the Sendai Framework Monitor was working, it became apparent that there were problems with how countries and UN member states understood what the all hazards approach was. And in 2018, we discussed this, and in 2019, I was asked to chair a working group, on how we could understand hazard definition and classification and how we might interpret this for hazard information profiles. These both were published, one in July 2020, in the middle of COVID, and the other in October 2021, when we were still looking at COVID. So at a time when everybody was very much involved with a really pandemic of international concern. So the Sendai Framework has been the reason why we've been doing this. The Sendai Framework talks from 2015 to 2030, and it looks very much at the all-hazard approach to reduce mortality, affected people, economic loss, and damage to critical infrastructure and disruption of basic services. But it also calls for, in the global targets and indicators, the need to increase a country's national and local disaster risk reduction strategies, to build international cooperation, to all countries, but particularly to lower and middle income countries, and increase the availability and access to multi-hazard early warning systems and disaster risk information and assessments for all people of the world, which you will see come up later. Now, of course, the 4 priorities for action under the Sendai framework are understanding disaster risk, which is very heavily based in the science domain, strengthening disaster risk governance to manage disaster risk, which of course calls for a lot of science engagement with UN member states, investing in disaster risk reduction for resilience, and finally, talking much more about enhancing disaster preparedness for effective response and recovery, including Build Back Better for rehabilitation and reconstruction. And all of these really rely on the fact that we need to understand what the Sendai framework calls for in an all-hazards approach. It calls for strengthening technical capacity and scientific capacity to capitalize on and consolidate existing knowledge and to develop and apply methodologies and models. Why? Because we need to assess disaster risks, vulnerabilities, and exposure to all hazards. And this was a really important call that we needed to understand. The hazard information profiles were really developed to address this need with scientists from all over the world, and I'll show you where they've come from, to look at the existing list of hazards and check on the hazard needs of the users. How do we share this with the users? And this session today will focus particularly on users. And the effort was supported by the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction and the International Science Council, bringing together approximately 800 global experts, so incredible development. We had a very clear process of how we would do this. We looked at the UN General Assembly agreed definition, which came from paragraph 50 of the Sendai framework, of how we would define hazards. And that definition of how we would define hazards was clear, but difficult to interpret, and we fully recognize that. So we knew we had to improve that. And in order to pull this together, as Urbano will remember, we pulled together every single scientific hazard glossary, I'm ashamed to say only in English, but there were a lot of them. We pulled together IRDR and its peril classification. We looked at every UN glossary we could access as well. And we looked at the Sendai Framework Monitor Hazard List and then did surveys of scientists who were particularly involved in hazards, but also consultations with many experts in the scientific and other communities to understand it. We agreed the inclusion criteria that the hazard has the potential to impact on a community, there are proactive and reactive measures are available, and that the hazard has measurable spatial and temporal components. This applies to most of the hazards, but not all of them. But we ended up with 302 hazards. So let me just show you how we did this. So we brought together our incredible family of the United Nations Office of Disaster Risk Reduction UN agencies, of the World Meteorological Organization, the World Health Organization, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. In fact, there were about 40 different intergovernmental agencies and organizations linked to the United Nations who were involved in this work. And this incredible network of scientists through the International Science Council, who was so important to us to try and understand how we could bring this data together, including the Global Earthquake Monitor, the GEO team, but also the Committee on Data, where we're looking at how we can use this information, but of course the Integrated Research on Disaster Risk team, which I hope that Sani will be here later today to talk to us about some of that work. But we knew we couldn't do it without the industrial science partners. So we went to the Insurance Development Forum, who are providing a reinsurance network. But to me, as somebody who's responded to so many disasters, we also looked to the International Federation of the Red Cross, Red Crescent, to bring in the community aspect of this work. Of these 302 hazards, it was very clear that we would have hydrometeorological hazards, which of course have been so enormous recently in our world, from the extreme heat and the call for action from the UN Secretary General that came out in July, but also the terrible flooding events that have even happened Albano, very sadly, in Spain recently. And we send you thoughts to Spain as real concern. But we were allowed to include extraterrestrial hazards, and we'll show you some of those, and we'll also included a lot of the geological hazards, some of the more conventional hazards that people talked about. But we've included environmental hazards that we think are particularly important, and the chemical hazards that matter so much to so many. And we were allowed to include the biological hazards, and that was a very interesting debate that we had there. Then we have the technological hazards that include radiation, transport, waste, cybersecurity, and a whole range of other things that seem to fit in there, like dam failures and bridge failures. But equally, for completeness, although not part of the Sendai framework, we were allowed to include the societal hazards. So let me just show you some of these hazards. This is one that looks at coastal flooding. You'll see that we have the highest level of a definition we can find, and that's in the UN, which is the World Meteorological definition. We've got the UV radiation. This actually comes from the government of Canada, this definition, but obviously the World Health Organization is much involved there. The earthquake information, this comes from the United States Geological Survey. There's no UN agency that particularly looks after geological hazards, so we've had to seek a much wider engagement. Air pollution, this time it comes from a source that we found very important, which is a point source, although there's a lot of ambient air pollution that is dealt with by WHO and household air pollution. Microplastics have become increasingly important, and this comes from the United Nations Environment Programme and NOAA, who have been very helpful from the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration to pull this definition together. There's a lot of work going on at the moment for a microplastics treaty, which I hope will come through. Now, obviously, COVID was at this time, and this is the COVID draft hazard information profile. What we do know is that it's not a complete one, because this was prepared really before we knew a lot of the evidence about COVID, so it's got a very long definition, links to the World Health Organization, but also we probably need to think about how we can improve it for this update we're looking at. Dam failure comes from the definition of the International Commission on Large Dams, a really important one if we just think about the terrible dam failure that occurred in North Africa last year, where a lot of people lost their lives. And finally, we just thought we'd add explosive remnants of war. This comes from the United Nations, their network, this definition. So you can see the range of these different types of hazards, and their definitions are really important and how we found the information. But to explain more about how they work, this is the riverine fluvial flood hazard information profile. The aim was to keep them as short as reasonably possible, preferably no more than 2 pages, all with open source referencing wherever we could, linking to a UN organization or other agency that might be able to help us to coordinate and update the definitions, but to include things like annotations, additional scientific information, things like metrics where we knew it, key relevant conventions, and examples of drivers, outcomes, and risk assessment. What we knew at the end of our piece of work that was published in 2021 was that we had to use this hazard list to actively engage policymakers and scientists in evidence-based national risk assessment processes, disaster risk reduction, risk-informed sustainable development, and other actions aimed at managing risks and emergencies and disasters. But we also were called very much to address cascading and complex hazards and risks. And I'm really grateful to my good colleague Albano for being here to talk further about this, because his help has been absolutely critical in our learning. Why does the hazard information definitions matter? Well, we were very honored when the UNDRR said that this list of hazard definitions and classification and the hazard information profile support the Sendai framework, the Sustainable Development Goals, and the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, by providing a common set of hazard definitions for monitoring and reviewing implementation. And this is particularly why we're so pleased that Teresa is here to help us to really understand how we work to build this evidence. They are now all online. I'm really pleased to say that they're available to all, and it's very clear that we try and provide a common set of hazard definitions to governments and stakeholders to inform their strategies and action on risk reduction and management. When we came to the midterm review of the Sendai framework, we were really honoured and delighted to be told that the work we had been doing had been groundbreaking. And that was a real privilege, and it was seen to be really useful. So I'm really grateful to this. So I'm going to hand over to Helene, who will tell you about our current review process. Helene, to you.
Thank you very much, Virginia. So we had already a very good document that was produced in 2020 and 2021. But we all know that we are in an area where the information changes very rapidly, when new information comes every day based on our experience and on our research. So, as mentioned before, there was a recommendation that the hazard information profile were to be reviewed and updated regularly. So we are now entering the first review cycle for them. So we made a user survey that we will give a bit more details later on, but the feedback on the survey was that the document was a very good one. So because of that, we decided to go to a light touch review. We will not reinvent the wheel, we will not start from scratch. We'll just add new information when it's necessary. We will keep the format as it is, roughly. So we will add new scientific information wherever it is relevant. We will do some light changes in the terminology. We use outcomes at the moment, but we get some feedback that it's not really clear. People use impact, so we use impacts instead. And we are also told that there are very good documents for independent hazards, but in the real life, hazards do not occur separately. They occur generally together. So we need to provide more information on the multi-hazard context. We also want to update the references, because we want the references to be as often as possible open source, so people can really go there without having to go through different hurdles. And we also want them to be both scientifically robust, but also accessible for the users that are non-specialists. And we also want to kind of constrain some of our scientific colleagues who want to put all the references they have. And so we have a very long list of references. So we want to really shorten that list to 10 to 20, so we really have the key ones. So all the sections will be reviewed and revised if needed. There is a specific aspect to this light touch review for the chemical and the biological heaps, is to make them as much as possible future-proof. So what we mean by that is that we have a list of chemical hazards that are based on chemical agents, chemical molecules. But we also know that we have new chemical molecules that are produced and put on the market every day or every week. We cannot have one hazard information profile for each of those products. It is not possible, and it is not manageable. So what the special team for the chemical heaps has done is that they tried to make some new type of heaps, what we call the chapeau heaps, that are not for individual molecules, but are for a class of molecules that have the same characteristics and create the same type of hazard. So, for example, we will have now a new heap that will be on asphyxiant gases. And in that, you will have the information that are common to all those gases and some examples. And you will have some specific heaps as example as well. They will do the same for the biological heaps, because we cannot put all diseases and all viruses and bacteria out there. So we also have this class, these chapeau heaps, that are a new part of this light touch review. To conduct that process, we need to rely on a very strong and robust scientific expertise. So we have a steering group that is tasked to lead the process. This steering group includes members from UN agencies, from academia, from the NGOs, from international organizations, from the private sector, to try to have a broad view and a broad approach on these issues. But this steering group cannot do the work on their own. So they are supported by 8 technical teams, one for each type of hazard, that are also including experts that comes from different range. You have, for example, for the geological hazards, you have experts in volcanoes, you have experts in earthquakes, you have experts on landslides. We try to make sure that those groups are as diverse as possible, with a broad geographic distribution of their members, also, if possible, the gender balance. And where we're talking about experts in academia, we also try to have experts that are at different stages of their career. So we really have as diverse a group as possible to give a broad view of that. We will have, but that will be developed by Teresa, we also see those hazard information profile at the interface between the science and the users and the policymakers. So to support the steering group to make sure that these hazard information profile are accessible and useful for a broad range of users, we also established a user group that provides feedback on the usability and the accessibility and the relevance of those HIPs for different groups of users. But Teresa will discuss more about that. We have, on top of these technical teams, we have one specific group that focuses on the multi-hazard context. Urbano will talk to us about that a bit later. We also have a specific group that is working on machine actionability of the HIPs. We all know that artificial intelligence and machines are now more and more used to access, analyze, and use a broad range of information that are available on different systems and formats, something that cannot be done by human workforce alone. So it is very important that this new version of the hazard information profiles can also be produced not only in a format that is accessible and useful and agreeable for human, but also useful for machines. So we have a specific group that is dedicated for that, so that we hope to have in the near future the HIPs that will be available in a written format that you can see here, or in the PDF format. We have the online version that Virginia mentioned earlier, but we will also have a specific coded version that will be used for machines. We hope especially for database management and data analysis. We will launch the revised version of this hazard information profile at the Global Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction in early June next year in Geneva, from the 2nd to the 6th of June. That will be a special event for that, and also more information of it. So we hope to see you at this event as well. So you saw earlier the format of the HIPs. The revised format of the HIP is slightly different, but not that much. So we still have the primary definition, that is a key area. In the annotation, we have the synonyms. That is very, very important, because we do not all use the same terms for the same hazards. One very well-known example is tropical cyclone, that is called tropical cyclones in one part of the world, hurricanes in another part of the world, and typhoons in the third part of the world. So we need to have the HIPs that acknowledge that and include as many local names as possible so that people recognize what this hazard is. We have an additional scientific description that gives you a bit more details on what this hazard is about. Metrics and numerical limits are also very important, especially when it comes to database, risk analysis, and statistics. Key relevant UN convention and multilateral treaties. It sounds a bit administrative, but it's in fact very useful for the users, because they realize what kind of agreement their country sign on and what they should report to, for example. We also want to have an example of drivers, impacts, and risk management. That includes a section on the multi-hazard context, and when relevant, it includes a section on monitoring and early warning. We know that not all hazards have early warning system, but most of them, if not all of them, has a monitoring system in place, and that's a very important information as well. Because we are scientists, we have a section on references, so that the people who want more information can find a reference to that. And what is important is also the coordinating agency of organization at the global level, because it can be also important for the countries when they develop their plans for disaster risk reduction to be able to liaise with this organization to make sure that they align with the global and local aspect. So this is how the process is taking place. We have, I would say, already hundreds of experts currently working on the revision of the HIPs, and we hope to have much more coming on for the review of the updated HIPs. I would like now to give the floor to Urbano, who will give you more details on the multi-hazard and the early warning context. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Helen. It's interesting how there is a definition of hazard, but this definition also includes the multi-hazard dimension. And it's not just the Sendai framework as an agreement, but also the definitions made by UNDRR, which says that hazardous events may occur simultaneously, cascadingly, or cumulatively over time. So this leads us to, when examining hazards, we have to take into account the potential interrelated effects between these hazards. The issue here is how can be this operational, because as Helen said, this is science, but science for policymaking. And this has to be understood by different audiences, not just experts or policymakers, but also those who are not experts in disaster risk, who collect data or use the data. So how can we interpret multi-hazard? Because this is seen from different points of view. Multi-hazard is understood as more than one independent hazards. It is also understood as overlapping hazards, and it is also understood as hazard interactions with dependencies between them. So if we use an example of this, we are exploring in this review how to represent this multi-hazard dimension of hazard events. And the example of tsunamis is very illustrative because there are two main triggers of tsunamis, which are geological in the case of volcanic hazards and earthquakes. But also we have to take into account that tsunamis also are the cause of other hazards that also trigger other hazards. One example could be the Hungatunga 2022 subsurface volcanic eruption, which caused a tsunami. And this tsunami caused far away from the source of the volcanic eruption, like Peru, an oil spill. So here we have three connected hazards that are linked to the same hazard event. So how can we represent this? How can we collect data about this event? What is part of the event and what is not? Those are the questions that have to be resolved. And also there are feedback loops. One example could be the 1999 Kocaeli earthquake in the Gulf of Izmit in Turkey, where the earthquake caused an oil spill and also a spill of other substances in two different industries, but also the earthquake caused a break in the supply of energy and the supply of water, and this impeded the extinguishing the fire or acting the pumps to extract the products that were released. So how can we represent this? The debate is about representing it narratively or visually. Visually is very illustrative for anyone who is not an expert, because it can the different relationships can be identified easily and visually, and also can be registered as the different hazards can be registered in the same event. Also, the hazard events have, and their interactions have, spatial and temporal dimensions. And this causes issues relating to hazard management. Because if we look at one example, which is the Tohoku earthquake in 2011, the nuclear accident, the tsunami, and the earthquake presented different challenges for the management of at the local scale, but also at the national Japan government. So, because the areas that were affected by the different hazards were the same in some cases, but others were not, and some events also impeded managing. Like the nuclear accident impeded to properly manage other hazards like the earthquake or the tsunami in coastal areas. So by including the different relationships between and connections between hazards, the HIPs are moving towards a kind of ontology where not only the hazards themselves are described and explained, but also the relationships in hazard events are also reflected in the HIPs. The inclusion of the second subsection in the description of the HIPs, which is monitoring and early warning, also has some challenges relating to not becoming a manual for emergency preparedness or early action, but to reflect how the hazards can be described in this situation and used in this situation. This is very much connected to an initiative by UN, which is the Early Warnings for All, that draws from two other initiatives in two UN organizations. In the case of the World Meteorological Organization, the Climate Risk and Early Warning Systems, and in the case of the World Health Organization, the concept of Early Warning Alert and Response System. So this initiative relates very much to the former subsection through the concept of multi-hazard early warning systems. Because different systems need to be communicated in order to be effective, the synergies are promoted between the different components, and this requires hazard monitoring and forecasting. Early Warnings for All initiative also seeks to reduce social inequity. This inequity not only takes place in terms of exposure to hazards, but also in response. And this includes vulnerable populations like persons with disabilities. And Virginia mentioned earlier the case of Spain recently, and we have seen there that among the more than 200 victims in the disaster, almost half of them were elderly, people who couldn't move, who couldn't escape and go to a safe place. So this is not just an issue for developing countries, but also for developed countries. And here is an example of how these monitoring and early warning systems can be reflected in the review by considering different key components, which are who is the owner of the information about the hazards and their interactions, who is the actor or agency who is in charge of monitoring and observing the hazard, and also what's the lead time for the people to escape from a certain hazard activation or warning activation. It's critical to identify these issues, and we are discussing if other issues should be included, and here the user group is critical because they can identify as users with what kind of information in the HIPs should be included, and the discussion is ongoing on this issue. This early warning and early action initiative by WMO is based on 4 pillars, and these pillars are disaster risk knowledge, detection, observation, monitoring, analysis, and forecasting, warning, dissemination, communication, and in the 4th place, preparedness and response capabilities. The most related pillars with the HIPs, with the review of the HIPs, are in particular disaster risk knowledge and monitoring or observation and forecasting. But another issue that has to be taken into consideration is that there is a flow of information between the different pillars, the different components of the initiative, and one critical component that is to be also referred to later on are protocols, are standards, and somehow the common alerting protocol is a kind of a standard that is being used that includes hazard information, and this is a critical component for the communication between these 4 components. The HIPs are establishing not just a common language about hazards, but also a common language about multi-hazard interactions, and also early warning and monitoring. And this common language facilitates the dialogue between the different social actors, policymakers, scientists, practitioners, and in the international arena with different international agreements, but also at the national, regional, and local scales by facilitating this communication between the different management components. So the HIPs are establishing a sound basis, scientific basis, as a result of the broad consultation process, and this secures continuity and not causes disruption, as Hélène said when identifying that the review is a light review. But it is interesting how, in the end, we are moving towards an authoritative definition of hazards and authoritative language that helps to communicate better between all different actors. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Urbano. Before we move forward to the involvement of users and to some examples of the use of the HIPs, I would like to give you the opportunity to ask questions, if you have, on the process, on how it works, and on the different hazards that we have. The floor is yours. No questions so far. We have been extremely clear, obviously. Okay, thank you very much. So I would like to give the floor to Teresa, who will tell you more about the involvement of users in this process. Thank you very much.
Hello, good morning, everybody. First of all, I would like to deeply thank to Professor Virginia Murray and Hélène for the kind invitation to be here today, presenting and talking about statistics involved with HIPs. So, it is a huge pleasure to talk on the role of statistics and risk analysis on the HIPs. And as all of you are aware of, statistics is needed in almost all the areas in order to achieve knowledge and extract useful information from data. But data quality is crucial to reach faithful and sustainable conclusions. So the HIPs are very, very important on this aspect because they conduct us to the main aspects of research, identifying the HIPs and helping on clusters identification and multi-hazard aspects for modeling and inference ideas and aspects. So the new millennium, as you know, and as we all have been attending, brought us a huge amount of new hazards and aspects that were not a reality previously. So this group team identified already 103 hazards, but many will come in the near future, I think, taking into account the new challenges of artificial intelligence, security, confidentiality, and ethic aspects, among others. So, moreover, we will all now attend to a huge change on the way of computing, namely by using the quantum computers and quantum computation that will bring us a lot of new challenges, and we must be aware of that while working with HIPS development. So as a preliminary work, we are presenting a user survey that was conducted in January, February this year, and 95 people answered from 62 countries. So we have, let's say, a very small sample, but already with important answers to our questionnaire. So about this, we took into account disaster risk reduction planning, disaster response planning, disaster risks monitoring, research, training, education, and others. And we can see that people are most aware of disaster response planning, and there is a special concern on training and education challenges. So we intend to go further and to replicate this experience in the next few months to obtain new results and to see how science is advancing in this part. So a few quotes, it's encyclopedic. The key thing is that the profiles are succinct and sufficiently noted. So they are good, however, they are uneven standard across 302 hazards. So clear definitions, and also I appreciate that alternative definitions are also listened. So we will provide basic information for non-experts and a good resource to be shared all over the world and to start for new achievements. So on a global level, the ability to standardize core ideas, definitions, formats, aids in the ability to streamline a coordinated planning approach in the most useful way possible for the country level. So now we are very concerned also and betting on the cyber hazards, but still we have misinformation or disinformation about it. So HIPs are valuable resources that contribute to effective DRR. So the profiles offer detailed insights into various hazards, aiding risk assessment, preparedness planning, and resource allocation. By enhancing community awareness, supporting policy formulation, and serve as crucial tools for informed decision-making. They play a vital role in my work as statistician and engaging communities, guiding policy makers and assisting emergency responders during disaster events, which unfortunately have been happening all over the world with more frequency lately. So additionally, hazard information profiles contribute to monitoring and evaluating the effectiveness of risk reduction measures, fostering a proactive and resilient approach to managing the impacts of natural hazards at local, national, and international levels. Quote from a respond based in a National Disaster Management Office in the Pacific. So our user group also defined the HIPs that are at the interface between science and policy. As such, it is essential to get feedback from a user's perspective. A user group is established with members coming from different world regions and different sectors and also different backgrounds. So the user group provides feedback on the format and content of the HIPs. Their feedback is shared with the other groups, leading the revision of the HIPs, and will be involved in the final review of the revised version that we are expecting in next June. So now I think it's time for Professor Virginia Murray to talk about the use of HIPs to standardize the hazard information. Thank you so much for listening to me, and any question you can ask Professor Murray or Ellen by email, for example. Thank you so much, Virginia. It is a huge pleasure to be here. You can
Teresa,
count always with my support whenever you wish.
Thank you so much. But what you didn't mention was how useful you think this community, this resource might be for statisticians.
Oh, yes, I talked about that. It is really, really very useful. Because if we don't have the clear idea of HIPs, we cannot use statistics with safety. We are lost somehow in the world in all these aspects of risks, because hazards come from everywhere. If we don't have these definitions, and if we don't have clear databases and safe databases, we cannot have quality data to analyze. So for statistics, this is a really a huge advancement in science and very, very important for us all.
So I thank you for that, Teresa. So I'm just going to talk about the use of HIPs to try and standardize hazard information.
Thank you so much.
So this is the next step, but thank you for everything. So first of all, we're going to go and listen to a wonderful video that is coming from our Colombian colleagues, Carolina Velasquez. Is this going to work? Can we run the video? Can you turn up the video?
No, the video is working.
A simple example using the in a project with resilient solutions and
Sorry, the sound's not coming through. It's a wonderful video. Do you want to start again? Please start again.
But first, in order to do that, we need to Hi everyone, my name is Carolina Velázquez Calderón, an assistant professor in the Department of Geography at Florida State University. I also part of the user group for the review of the hazard information profiles. And the idea for today is sharing with you briefly a simple example using the hazard identification profile HIP for analyzing the Colombian risk landscape. Thank you to the International Science Council for this opportunity. Project with Resilient Solutions and the German cooperation under the Global Initiative for Disaster Risk Reduction in strengthening risk-informed development approach in Colombia. But first, in order to do that, we needed to understand the risk landscape of the country. In order to understand the Colombia risk landscape, I used the National Unit for Disaster Risk Management Emergency Frequency Dataset from 1989 to 2021. I depurated the data after I analyzed the hazard information profile, reviewing the conceptualization and classification for each hazard and cluster, and after that I reclassified the hazard using the HIP framework. Some of the general results when I depurated the data and I worked with this dataset is that I found 42 hazards, each one with minimal description and comments about the configuration of the hazard. However, I consolidated them into 18 different types of hazard, and then I integrated into 8 clusters following the hazard identification profile framework. So meteorological and hydrological hazards account for the majority of reported incidents and emergencies in Colombia. You can see in the graph that 26,112 occurrences in Colombia indicating the significant impact. For instance, under this category, under this cluster, floods, storms, tropical events, and flash floods are included. The second most frequent hazard clusters was environmental hazards, with 16,317 occurrences between 1989 and 2021. And this category reflects substantial environmental challenges for Colombia. So, under this category, we can find deforestation, wildfires. When reflecting on this experience, several lessons learned emerged regarding hazard identification and risk profiling in Colombia. One of the most critical takeaways was the importance of developing a unified approach to hazard description and classification across provinces. This will significantly improve data quality and ensure the information is usable for risk management and decision making at the national level. Another lesson was the value of incorporating hazard names and classifications used by ethnic groups. Recognizing local terminologies not only ensures better representation of diverse cultural contexts, but also strengthens communication at the local level, making hazard management more inclusive and effective. Also, community engagement is key. Now, the lesson learned from the hazard profile, information profile. So, flexibility in frameworks. The HIP framework must be flexible, as a recommendation, enough to accommodate local terminologies and context-specific hazards. Clarity in language, so simplifying the technical language used in hazard profile is crucial by making the profile more accessible to both technical and non-technical users. Well, this is the end of the presentation, and I just want to say thank you so much to International Science Council. Please take a note of my email. Any comment, any question, please reach out, send an email, and thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Every thanks to you, Carolina. What a wonderful video. I love the fact you've been able to use the hazard information profiles to look at your incredible database in Colombia of all the hazard events going back to the 1990s. Your sharing of this information is really important because what you have shown us is that the hazard information profiles are almost a pick and mix list of hazards that different countries, different areas, different regions might need. But most importantly, it must reflect a common standard and must reflect the cultural needs of those localities who are at risk. So huge thanks to you, Carolina, for your wonderful engagement and being a brilliant user of our hazard information profiles and a great advisor to the whole programme. So the background of the HIPS is very clearly summarised on the UN Office of Disaster Risk Reduction website. But what I thought would be really important to pull out is the bit about what these hazard information profiles should be contributing to. We know that we need a coherent view of hazards that can support countries, localities, regions, individuals. And one of the most important things that we're being asked to use these hazard information profiles on, besides early warning for all, and thank you, Urbano, for your very good discussion on that, is to report effectively on loss and damage. Because if we can understand the impacts of these events, we're in a much better position to be able to try and see what we should plan for next. So that means that we need to implement a comprehensive and inclusive approach to the development of disaster risk reduction strategies, and ultimately to develop this thing that you were summarising so well, Urbano, on developing and the use of multi-hazard early warning systems effectively, and to forecast eventually events for the future. How are we going to do this? Where do we go to in the future? So you might not be aware, but the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, in partnership with the World Meteorological Organization and the UN Development Programme, and many others, Hélène and I others have been to many of these meetings, are looking at developing a disaster losses and damage tracking system so that we can start understanding this much more. And I believe that they hope to launch this early next year. What will it look like? Well, it'll have hazard parameters, effect and impact, and statistics and contextual data. So very much reflecting Teresa's work and all the work that we need to understand for disaster-related statistics. This graphic really tries to show how we pull together things such as the cataloguing of hazardous events, which is a World Meteorological Organization program that Hélène and I are part of, then recording of the events by the National Disaster Management Agency, and then building the statistical data. Really critical. But all of this, as Teresa says, relies on ensuring data standards. And we obviously have the hazard classification and definitions at the heart of it, with the hazard information profiles, for which we're very honoured. But in this slide that I have borrowed from the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, you'll notice the guidance that we have prepared as a health professional with our team supporting WHO on the technical guidance notes on Sendai framework reporting for ministries of health. Something that is really critical to us, along with the technical guidance from a monitoring, understanding how we get to those global targets that UNDRR prepared. We link closely to the Statistical Commission to try and build some of that knowledge, and we know much more work is going on there with incredible work on disaster-related statistics and the frameworks that they've been building. And Teresa, I know, was very much involved in a meeting only in the last few weeks that was held in Africa, in Ethiopia, where she was talking about this issue as well. And behind that, we have the Sendai framework terminologies, which we think are very important, which have been agreed. Now, can I hand over to you, Hélène, again, to give us the next steps, please?
Thank you very much. Is there any questions on this second part of the presentation, or question that you have the time to develop from the first half of the presentation? Still not. Well, we're really, very, very clear. So I hope that we managed to demonstrate to you this morning that it is essential for risk assessment, risk management, risk reduction to better understand risk and to standardize the information you collect about the different aspects of the risk, starting with the hazard, and that the HIPs are very, very useful for that. Now, where are we and what are our next steps? So I'm going to say a bit provocatively that our work is almost done, and your work is going to start very soon. Why is it? Because we are now sending a call for the reviewers for the updated version of the HIPs. The scientists in our expert teams are almost finished to revise the HIPs and to revise the versions. They have made sure that the information that is currently presented in the HIPs is scientifically up to date, is scientifically robust, and is as accessible as possible from a scientist's standards. Now, what we want to do is to share those revised versions as broadly as possible to people who are willing to review them and to send us feedback. It may be feedback on the format. It may be feedback on the text, saying that this information in this section is a good one, but the text is a bit difficult to read. Can you please simplify that, as Carolina mentioned? It can be the addition of local or regional synonyms that you know about that are not represented on the HIPs. Once again, as Carolina said. So, we have this call that is available on the website of the International Science Council. You have flyers outside of this room with QR code that will send you straight to this page, to the page on the project, and you can go there from it. So, we would like you to answer this call. You can do this. You can be a reviewer if you are an expert on one of these hazards and you want to check that the information is there. But you can also be a reviewer if you are not an expert, but this is something that you're really interested in or really anxious about, or that it's a big part of your work, and we want to make sure that from your perspective, the HIPs is in the format and has content that is really useful for you. So please, this document, it is not our document. It is your document. You are the ones who are going to use it for your work. So we want to make sure that we hit the target and that you can really use it in your daily work. So I would really, really ask you to kindly answer this call and share it with everyone. You can find information on this page for the project on the website of the International Science Council. You can also, of course, send us questions on those emails. And it's a really co-produced information and co-produced document. So we really want to have this interaction between the science sphere on one hand and the user sphere, so that we can really combine our knowledge and expertise and experience to make a very useful document. Any questions remaining? Because if not, I would like to move the rest of the session, which is about half an hour, into something a bit more participative and interactive. We have brought with us the paper version of the HIPs. So I would like to invite you to move closer and to have a look at them and to have a look at the HIPs that are presented and tell us what are the ones that you would like to use. Is there ones that you find are missing? How would you use them for your work? And any other comments that you have on them. It's a work in progress. Your feedback is more than welcome. And thank you very much for your attention. Another part. We have another video that was, unfortunately, we could not read on the system. We have it there, so if in the computer, so we can all sit together looking at the screen, a smaller screen, but get together to have a look at it. Thank you very much.